Okay everyone, this is a video on why the Romanian Leu is crashing. The Leu is the money of Romania, and so I didn't know it was crashing. I haven't looked into it. I will look into how it's crashing. Obviously, hopefully this video tells us, but when I was living in Romania, it was about 4 lei equaled $1. So let's see if that's pretty similar to what it is right now. Let's get started here.
This video was brought to you by Ground News. For most of the past few years, Romania's currency, the leu, has held remarkably steady at just under 5 to the euro. However, earlier this week, just a day or so after the first round of the presidential election, the currency suddenly crashed, forcing the Romanian central bank to intervene.
Shoot.
So in this video, we're going to explain why the leu has crashed, whether the central bank can hold the line, and why all of this could be bad news for the right-wing frontrunner in Romania's presidential election, George Simion, and his prospective prime minister, Călin Georgescu.
I haven't been keeping up with the presidential elections, but Călin Georgescu was the presidential candidate originally, and now obviously he's changed prime minister. I don't know why, but George Simion is now the leading candidate. So that's pretty crazy. Pretty wild. I didn't know all of that happened.
Everyone talks about the left and right of politics, but in Europe there's something new emerging, a new right. In the latest issue of our magazine, we explain this new phenomena and run through some of the elections the new right have been winning. Read more by clicking the link in the description. So, let's start with a bit of context. Despite having been a member of the EU since 2007, Romania still uses its own currency, the leu, instead of the euro. In accordance with Article 140 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, Romania was supposed to adopt the euro once it had met the 4 so-called convergence criteria. Specifically, this required 1. An annual inflation rate no more than 1.5 percentage points higher than the average of the 3 best performing EU member states in terms of price stability. 2. Long-term borrowing costs no more than 2 percentage points higher than the average of the same 3 EU member states. 3. A budget deficit less than 3% of GDP, and a debt-to-GDP ratio below 60% of GDP.
Wow.
Or at least for Romania to be moving towards these targets at, quote, a satisfactory pace. And 4, for the leu to essentially hold its value against the euro via the exchange rate mechanism for at least 2 years. Unfortunately, Romania has struggled to meet basically all of these criteria.
Shoot.
Since joining the EU in 2007, year-on-year inflation has averaged at about 4%, double the European Central Bank's 2% target, and usually a fair bit higher than the EU average. Romanian borrowing costs have also been far higher than that of most European countries, with the annual yield on 10-year Romanian bonds hovering at around 7.5%, more than double that of French debt and more than triple that of German debt. Now, this is in part because Romania issues more debt than it probably should. While its overall debt burden isn't that big, at just 53% of GDP, the government regularly runs deficits above the 3% of GDP target set by the EU, and the EU is actually forecasting a massive 8% deficit in 2025.
Shoot.
Finally, the Romanian leu has been steadily depreciating against the euro, really since Romania joined the EU, going from just over 3 leu to the euro in 2007, to 4 in 2009, to 5 leu to the euro in 2020. However, at about this time, the Romanian central bank decided that the leu had fallen far enough, and started intervening in the currency markets to protect the leu and stop it from falling past 5 to the euro. In practice, this basically means that the Romanian central bank would use its limited foreign exchange reserves to buy up leu on the market if it ever looked like the leu was depreciating past the 5 to the euro point, which is why the leu has been trading at between 4.9 and 5 to the euro since 2023. That was until Tuesday though, when the leu suddenly slipped to 5.12 to the euro in a single day. Now, a 2% movement might not sound like that much, but it's a pretty crazy swing by foreign exchange standards, as you can kind of see if you look at the 5-year graph. At the time of writing, it looks like the central bank has intervened, and they're now trying to hold the leu at just over 5.1 to the euro. But it's an open question as to whether they'll be able to maintain this peg if investors continue to sell. So what's going on here? Why is Leu suddenly crashing? Well, some of this is a consequence of the recent surge in the euro, which has been riding high ever since Trump started whacking tariffs on everyone, as investors looked for safe alternatives to the dollar. But the more proximate cause seems to be the looming prospect of George Simeon.
I do think the USD is definitely down in terms of power, and that's given the European Union more power because they are better trade partners at this point than my home country of America. Just in terms of ease and tariffs and everything, the European Union seems to be doing better. And with things like the Schengen zone, that's also really helpful. But this presidential election, I think, will be crucial for Romania's not only economic standpoint, but pretty much everything with Romania.
The founder and chairman of the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, who's usually described as far right in the international press, winning the upcoming presidential election. The election was originally scheduled for December, but the first result was annulled by Romania's constitutional court, which claimed that the Russian state had intervened on behalf of independent candidate Călin Georgescu, who won a 23% plurality of the votes in the first.
Oh, there's George Simeon right there. Okay, interesting. So he was in the first round. I know Călin Georgescu and Elena Lasconi were the two that were going to go in December, because then how Romanian elections work, that's how it happens, and you vote between two, the top two candidates. I don't know who George Simeon is going against now. I don't think it's Elena.
Round. Georgescu was then barred from running, and the first round was rescheduled for May 4th. Now, this election was always going to be somewhat of a two-horse race between...
That's Dan Nicușor, I think is his name. I don't know much about him, but the guy on the right is Dan.
Simeon and Nicușor Dan, a more centrist, pro-EU candidate who's currently mayor of Bucharest. But in the first round, Simeon drastically outperformed the polls, winning 41% of the vote, 20 points more than Dan. This is in large part because former Georgescu voters ended up flocking to Simeon, both because his politics are closer to Georgescu's than Dan's are, and because Simeon had promised to appoint Georgescu as Romania's prime minister.
Wow.
A runoff election is due for May 18th. But Simeon's outperformance in the first round means that he's now
I am filming this on May 17th, so we'll see how the second round of elections go here. I don't know who's going to be president. That's crazy.
Very much the bookies' favourite to win later this month. Polymarket, for instance, currently gives Simeon a roughly 3 in 4 chance of winning, up from about 40% before the first round happened.
Wow.
And, well, this looks like it's somewhat spooked the markets, and this is for at least 2 reasons. Firstly, while neither Simeon or Georgescu talk that much about economics, when they do, they come up with some pretty funky ideas. Georgescu, for instance, who, as a reminder, Simeon plans to appoint as prime minister, has in the past claimed that...
Which, just also as another side note, prime ministers have, in my understanding, have more power than presidents in Romania, which is kind of crazy. But, and maybe that's a misconstrued understanding, but I know they have a lot of power, as well as presidents.
That corporations present a greater danger to Romania than enemy states, pledged to, quote, challenge the corporate demon, and blamed George Soros and globalists for Romania's economic decline. For his part, Simeon has recently said that he's been inspired by Javier Milei's success in Argentina, and wants to dramatically cut down the size of the Romanian state. Now, Simeon obviously has a point. As we mentioned a moment ago, Romania is currently running an enormous budget deficit, but markets clearly aren't confident that this new administration will actually be able to deliver on any of these radical ideas. But the second reason that the markets are a bit jittery is that Simeon looks like he might be on a collision course with the EU. Despite making some Eurosceptic sounds during the campaign, Simeon has insisted that he won't try and take Romania out of either the EU or NATO. However, Georgescu wants to do both of these things, and both Simeon and Georgescu have previously been pretty sympathetic to Putin, which won't go down well in Brussels. Tensions with Brussels could ultimately mean less financial support from the EU, which would put further strain on both Romania's economy and its politics. Ultimately, this shouldn't be too surprising. Markets like stability, and the rise of Simeon and Georgescu threatens to upend Romanian politics. Nonetheless, this decline in the Leu could be really quite bad news for the new Romanian government. A weaker leu will make imports more expensive, thereby pushing up inflation, which is already running at 4% year on year. This would in turn put pressure on the government to provide more support for Romanian households, which could exacerbate the fiscal crisis.
Basically, what he just said there was like, if Romania leaves the EU and NATO, there will be taxes on like things coming into the country, and those taxes will drive the price of everything up. So like, let's say you get carrots from Bulgaria. I don't know if Bulgaria does great carrots or not, but let's say you get carrots from Bulgaria. If a carrot costs 1 leu right now, it would cost a leu 20 cents. So you get that extra tax because you're not part of the European Union. You're not part of the Schengen zone. You're not part of NATO, right? Like, you're going to get taxed because of this choice. And so that would drive prices up from goods outside of Romania coming in. The goods inside of Romania should likely stay pretty similar pricing.
This is a complex and nuanced story though, and there's plenty more to read about it online, with more than 232 sources reporting on the ongoing Romanian election. The issue is, how can you be sure that what you're reading isn't hugely biased? Well, that's the problem we face when making these videos too, and luckily that's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. For this story in particular, they've identified that there are at least also shown the main thing on framing the Twitter of the news, a visual back by the app is one side of the other side we mentioned behind the useful tool continues to evolve. So if you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, subscription, or by to ground.news independent news.
Oh man, that's lame. That's how he ended the video, was with his sponsor? Okay, well, oh, look at this. Maybe my next video, why Romanian's election spells bad news for Orban. Very interesting, for sure. I think some of the biggest things here are Romania's elections coming up are vitally crucial to Romania economically, as a country, in terms of like thinking and like how people like, for me especially, like someone who's an American, I think it would be harder for me to visit Romania if Romania did leave the EU. So there's definitely some bias on my side of like, I want Romania to stay in the EU. I want them to be part of the EU so that I can go and visit a lot easier. And I honestly think because Romania takes part in the EU, it's easier for people to get visas to America, like, or into Europe to go and work. So Romania can have money sent back to it or money brought back to it. I don't know. I'm not an economist, so this is really hard. And it's hard for me to see the leu start going like higher and higher in terms of how far away it's getting from the euro or the dollar or the pound. And that's hard to think about for Romanian people. But the hope is, keep our fingers crossed that Romania can bounce back. That's all we can hope for. Best of luck, guys. Hopefully the leu gets back down to 4 here shortly. Peace, guys.